Late bloomers tend to have more curiosity. They tend to have more resilience.
There are stories and mythology that this country has woven around Black men.
What if everything we've been taught is just all wrong?
What's worth more than this fear right now?
And that rising after failure is part of the glory of being a human being.
Listen to deeply personal, insightful, and thought-provoking stories from the world's leading thinkers and doers. Listen and subscribe to The Unmistakable Creative wherever you get your podcasts.
When you make decisions for your company, you look for the no-brainers. If you have a lot of mailing to do, Stamps.com is the ultimate no-brainer. Use the Stamps.com mobile app to mail everything you need to keep your business running with up to 89% off USPS and UPS. Make the same no-brainer decision as over 1 million other businesses with Stamps.com. Use code PROGRAM for a special offer. That's Stamps.com, code PROGRAM.
I'm Dom Nicholls, and this is Ukraine the Latest. Today, in a packed episode, we discuss the latest from the Kharkiv battlefield, Putin's visit to China, the assassination attempt on Robert Fico, why Germany's Defence Minister Boris Pistorius is on resignation watch, and later, we hear a set of recordings from David Knowles on the ground in Ukraine.
Bravery takes you through the most unimaginable hardships to finally reward you with victory.
If we give President Zelensky the tools, the Ukrainians will finish the job. Slava Ukraini!
Nobody's going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
Every weekday, we sit down with leading journalists from the Telegraph's London newsroom and our teams reporting on the ground to bring you the latest news and analysis on the war in Ukraine. It's Thursday, the 16th of May, 2 years and 83 days since the full-scale invasion began. Today, I'm joined by Assistant Comment Editor Francis Dearnley, Germany Correspondent James Rothwell, and, from somewhere near Lviv, David Knowles. I started with the latest news from Ukraine. The Ukrainian military said this morning its defensive actions had forced Russian troops to reduce the tempo of the offensive in the Kharkiv region. A reminder of the geography, just so we're all dialed in correctly. The border area, the border just north of Kharkiv, about 20 k's due north of the city. It runs generally northwest to southeast, but about 25 kilometres northeast of Kharkiv, it jinks back up to the north, or sort of northeast, effectively making a wedge shape on the map. Now, Russia has pushed on both sides of that wedge, with the town of Lipsy on the western side of the wedge and the town of Vovchansk on the eastern side. The fighting in the west is about 4 kilometres north of Lipsy and is in the northern suburbs of the town of Vovchansk in the east. Russia has not yet been able to link up those two groups, but has made most gains in the eastern bit. The Ukrainian military said it had continued combat in the northern parts of Vovchansk, but that the situation, this is what they're saying, the situation was now under control. They said the invaders had been unable to break through deeper into the town. In a statement, the Ukrainian General Staff said the enemy's plans to penetrate deeper into the town of Vovchansk and gain a foothold there were thwarted. Military spokesperson Nazar Voloshin said Ukrainian troops were focused on trying to prevent Russian forces establishing footholds in the north, or the region's north. Quote, "Our units detect separate enemy units, the location of artillery deployments, and inflict damage to prevent the enemy from accumulating forces and equipment in the northern part of the town of Vovchansk." That was said on TV. Now, geolocated footage from the Institute for the Study of War, posted today, but footage from yesterday, indicates Russian forces have advanced up to the east bank of the Traviansky Reservoir. That is a pretty sizable reservoir, about 5 kilometres long, just north of Lipsy and running due north almost up to the border itself. That's a significant geographic obstacle. It should hold up the Russian advance for some time, depending on what Ukraine put into the area. President Zelensky visited the area this morning, met with military chiefs near the front line. He said the situation in the Kharkiv region is generally under control, and our soldiers are inflicting significant losses on the occupier. However, the area remains extremely difficult. Interior Minister Ihor Klimenko, speaking this morning, he said Russian forces are taking Ukrainian civilians captive in Vovchansk and preventing their evacuation. On Telegram, he posted, we know of the first cases of executions of civilians by the Russian military. He said one resident was killed by Russian soldiers after he refused to obey their orders and attempted to escape on foot. Ukrainian police investigators have opened criminal cases. Now, AFP, Agence France-Presse, using data from the ISW, has calculated Russian forces across the whole of Ukraine have advanced 278 square kilometres since the start of this week-old offensive in the Kharkiv region, and across the south, obviously. This is their biggest gains in a year and a half. They are overwhelmingly in the north around this latest push. But to give you an idea of how the rest of the line is very largely static, in the week to yesterday, the Russian military gained 257 square kilometres of territory in the Kharkiv area, and that wedge I was talking about, and only 21 square kilometres across all other areas in the country. Now, that's not to say they are not shelling and lobbing missiles around and that there have been deaths and injuries across the country today. But in terms of land, there's very little movement, and it is vastly predominantly up in the north. Okay, the next one from me. Two alleged Ukrainian agents have been detained in Crimea. This is Russia's Federal Security Service, the FSB, claiming this. They said the agents are accused of sabotage in Crimea, and according to reports, one of them admitted to transferring information on air defense systems protecting the Crimean bridge. Russian state media also claimed the two had attempted to blow up railway lines across on the peninsula. Staying in Ukraine, staying in Crimea, and I'm seeing reports of more strikes last night on the Belbek and Simferopol air bases and Sevastopol. The Belbek air base is just to the north of Sevastopol. Drones and missiles are said to have been used. I can't see much detail elsewhere or from many different sites, but the Russian MOD said that they'd shot down 5 ATACMS missiles. Right, now forget the number. I don't believe numbers or the attribution of the weapon type for a moment. But if the Russian MOD is putting out statements that something's going on, then something happened. They are responding to something. Outside Ukraine now, and drones operated by Ukraine's military intelligence agency hit production facilities of the state-owned Russian weapons manufacturing company Basalt in the city of Tula last night. This is a military intelligence source speaking to the Kyiv Independent. Tula, the city, it's about 150 km south of Moscow, about 400 kilometers due north of Kharkiv. Kyiv Independent says that the Basalt facility is the main defense enterprise for the production and supply of weapons and ammunition for Russia's ground forces, air force, and navy. Now then, that's enough from the military updates. Looking sharp and always looking for love, it's the Telegraph's very own sharp-dressed man, Francis Dearnley. Francis, what's the latest from the political and diplomatic front, and what are you wearing?
Oh, yes. All right, Dom. I'm wearing black tie. Not for your benefit, I hasten to add, because I'm speaking at a dinner tonight and I'll need to dash there from Telegraph Towers before I can get changed. To stress listeners, I'm not actually wearing a bow tie yet. But to the news. As topped the episode yesterday, a major story broke out after our broadcast, namely an apparent assassination attempt on the Slovak president Robert Fico, sometimes pronounced Fico, in the town of Handlova in the west of his country. He was shot in the abdomen and received life-threatening injuries. He is said to be conscious in hospital at the time of recording, but updates are coming in thick and fast. Now, James is going to update us shortly, going into a bit more detail on what's occurred, some of the reaction, and remind us a little bit more about Fico's political career. But just to contextualise this and its relevance for Ukraine and wider Europe, Fico is a man who has been seen as more pro-Kremlin in his sympathies than his immediate predecessor. Listeners will also recall that he was elected on a platform of reducing military aid and support for Kyiv. That places him and his country as one of Europe's fault line nations, with an inner battle over its future, as we're seeing play out in Georgia in its most intense political form at the moment, of course Ukraine in the most intense military sense, as well as Moldova and the Balkans. As such, Russia was quick to condemn this attack, with Putin saying, "I was indignant to learn about the attempt on the life of the chairman of the government of the Slovak Republic. There can be no justification for this monstrous crime." Indeed, the Kremlin stooges were quick to try and find ways to blame Ukraine. Though curiously, from what we can tell of the attacker so far, he's a 71-year-old poet who formerly had links to a pro-Russia group. But of course, that won't stop the propagandists, who'll no doubt be working overtime to try and craft a narrative which points the finger at Zelensky. Already, the chairman of the Duma's Foreign Committee has said, and I quote, "There is a high probability that the West wanted to kill Fico because of his political views, which do not fit into the stereotypes of the hegemony of the collective West." Yet despite Fico's political beliefs, Western leaders too were very quick to condemn the attack, including Zelensky, who called it appalling. We'll have more on that story in a moment, as I say, as well as a bitter row between Chancellor Olaf Scholz and his defence minister over spending limits on the armed forces. But the other major political story of the day is Putin's advertised visit to Beijing, where President Xi welcomed an old friend, hailing the strategic guidance the two countries have provided each other. In comments to the cameras before their talks, the two leaders spoke about global stability and solving conflicts. Putin arrived at dawn and was driven in a motorcade to the Great Hall of the People, that massive state building on the western side of Tiananmen Square, used for ceremonial and political events. There he was greeted by Xi in a full military ceremony, the full works, including a gun salute from the army, as the pair celebrated the 75th anniversary of diplomatic relations forged between the former Soviet Union and the People's Republic of China after it swept to power in that civil war in 1949. Now, optically, as our Asia correspondent Nicholas Smith has written for The Telegraph, the Chinese and Russian leaders have presented a unified front at their press conferences, intending to showcase the deepening ties and cooperation on major foreign policy issues. The fact that they agreed over the need to resolve conflicts in Ukraine and Gaza, topping their agenda, appears to be an attempt to present a statesman-like partnership as an alternative to US global leadership, of course. An announcement by Putin welcoming Chinese car makers in Russia may have been another dig at the Biden administration, which in the past few days has announced it will quadruple tariffs on China's electric cars to 100%. Trade between China and Russia is flourishing, as listeners will know, and it's been vital for Russia in keeping its economy afloat since the war began. Now, during one of the press conferences, Putin said the relationship between China and Russia is reassuring for the world. Quote, "Our cooperation in world affairs today is one of the main stabilising factors in the international arena." He added, "Together we uphold the principles of justice and a democratic world order that reflects multipolar realities and is based on international law." The first bit is probably true. Without China, Russia may well have imploded, and that indeed is stabilising to a degree, although not in a way many Western countries would favour. Though the idea that they uphold together the principles of justice and democracy based on international law is, well, it's just the political equivalent of trolling, isn't it? It's speaking the language of the West whilst doing the exact opposite. That is, of course, unless they really believe that they are defending international law and democracy through their actions, or a version of democracy and international law. But if so, they are truly warped definitions by almost any metric, I would argue. So what is exactly China's strategy? I think it's just worth us asking that before we end this section. Xi is not stupid, after all. He knows this relationship makes the West nervous. Fundamentally, Russia is, at this stage at least, more of an asset than a liability. Moscow carries clout in the Middle East and Africa, it provides energy, and it has a similar view of the West, namely that it's in decline and that a new multipolar world, that phrase again, is emerging, where the US and its allies are no longer on top. As such, losing Russia would be a major blow to China's overarching strategic aim in the long term. However, and this is an important nuance, not all of China's inner experts are said to be favour backing Moscow to the hilt. They argue that China only allying itself with dictatorships is a dangerous step, as it could alienate democratic countries in Africa, in South America, who might want to be working more closely with China, as well as major economies in Europe and indeed the US, which it still has strong economic ties with, essential for China's continued growth. That is why we see Xi so eager to build strong ties with Paris and Berlin. It believes that it waters down the narrative that it's only out to replace America and the West as top dog. It also puts Europe in a difficult position if America were to ever encourage its allies to decouple their economies from China, as Germany, France and others would be too closely aligned to do this seriously. As such, that middle path between Russia and between Western economies suits China for now. But can that economic peace hold long term? Maybe not, which is why both West and East are also trying to make their economies self-resilient within their respective spheres of influence. That's a new development in the past few years. Ultimately, it will be for the Western powers, and especially the US, to make an offer to countries like Europe with regards to energy and other areas that are more attractive than China's. It's losing Africa, or has lost Africa in that fight, but much could change over the coming years as the tectonic plates of geopolitics move. So that's where we are, Dom, but I know James has more detail on Fico and those big developments in Berlin.
Yeah, thanks, Francis. James, I'll come to you in a moment, if I may. Francis, can I just stick with you and ask a question, ask you to put on your Kremlinology hat? This 2-day summit, there's going to be lots of warm words, but at the moment, the weight in this relationship, it's all China's way. What should we look out for in any kind of joint communique or any statements? What would show us quite where it is at the moment, the sort of the needle in this relationship? I mean, I imagine Putin's going to be talking about how strong the relationship is, how much it endures, how special it is, all the rest of it. And Xi Jinping will not want to upset his guest or upset the relationship at all, but he's not going to say, yeah, I'll tell you what, we'll give you a load of weapons as well. So how kind of lukewarm should we expect Xi Jinping's words to be, and what would be surprising for you?
Well, there's inevitably a caution always in what China says. I mean, listeners will recall that there was, I think, hesitation to be seen too overtly to be supporting Russia when this war began. Indeed, they were supporting them, but it's only become more overt over time. So it is important to always say that China thinks carefully about what it does. And indeed, it is indicative of the fact that Russia is doing better now in the war, that I think it is willing to more overtly talk about the virtues and strengths of the relationship that have been built between Beijing and Moscow. In terms of the explicit things that have already been said in this summit, they've talked about the strong relationship, as I said, the importance of them for providing stability for the world, which has elements of truth, albeit from a Western perspective, we would probably say in a harmful sense. What would surprise me, though, I mean, I think it would be surprising if we were, of course, to get any remark from Xi about Russia's challenges at the moment with regard to the military situation or its economy. I would be surprised if it were to make any overt commentary about the state of the war or Ukraine. I would be surprised if it weren't to make more references, as it already has, to the fact that they see themselves as offering a kind of alternative model to other countries around the world other than America and the West. I think that's the key driving force here. And really, the medium is the message, as I so often find myself saying on the podcast, which is whatever the words are, it's the very fact this summit is taking place that matters, and the optics of it. I spoke about the grandeur that's been put on for President Putin, the guns firing, etc. It's that gets the cut through. It's that's shown on the Kremlin's TVs and in Africa and in other places that are fault lines at the moment in this Cold War II, if we want to articulate it as such. And that's very powerful for Xi. It's very powerful for Russia, which, remember, nobody wanted to meet with Putin for a very long time when this war began. And it's very persuasive to some countries who, as I say, are currently trying to make up their collective minds about the direction of travel and whether they do align themselves more closely economically and politically with China, Russia, or do find themselves drawn still towards the West. But that tension point, Dom, that tension for China is critical here, between not wanting to be seen as the autocrat's friend, but wanting to be seen as a pragmatic power. And I don't know whether in the months and years ahead that is realistically going to be sustainable. It will depend, I think, largely on the fate of Ukraine in this war.
Well, thanks, Francis. James, welcome back to the pod. Be very keen to hear your thoughts on any of that stuff if you so wish. You've been around the blocks a few times, but also, what's your view on what's your analysis of the Fico assassination attempt, and why is Germany's Defence Minister Boris Pistorius on resignation watch?
Thanks, Dom. Well, starting with Robert Fico, just a couple of updates. The Slovakian authorities have said that he's not out of the woods yet. That's a slightly less optimistic prognosis of his situation after they said overnight that his condition has stabilised, although all the reporting that I've seen this morning does suggest that the Prime Minister of Slovakia will pull through. As you know, he was shot at least 5 times at this political event yesterday, which means, unfortunately, he clearly has suffered some very serious injuries. And over here in Germany, this will have evoked some memories, perhaps, of the shooting of Wolfgang Schäuble, the former German finance minister in the 1990s. And he, unfortunately, was confined to a wheelchair for the rest of his life, even though he survived the attack. So I think all Western leaders, and indeed Putin, actually, are clearly hoping, based on their comments, that the Slovakian Prime Minister makes a full recovery. We know that he has received surgery for an injury to his intestines, so wasn't shot in a sort of vital organ like the heart or the lungs. And it's very much a case of waiting and seeing where that goes. There's been a bit more information about the suspect as well, which has come out overnight. Francis touched on the fact that he had some affiliations with pro-Russian groups. Also, oddly enough, he was the founder of an NGO against violence in 2015. So this suspect has been on a bit of a journey, you might say, since then. He's also a poet, would you believe it? He's published several poetry collections, he published a novel and a book, and he also posted all sorts of screeds on social media complaining about the coarseness of political rhetoric in Slovakia. So it's a bit of a mixed picture, really, as to what his motivations might have been. Of course, inevitably, there's speculation in a case like this. This person may also have had mental issues in addition to any kind of extremist political ideology. We will see where things progress and keep you updated on that. You also asked about the row in Germany between Defence Minister Boris Pistorius and Chancellor Olaf Scholz. That's really heating up. The German papers this morning are awash with speculation that Mr. Pistorius is on resignation watch. The root of this row, in essence, is that Mr. Pistorius wants a significant increase in funding for the Bundeswehr. He'd like to see it go up by about 6.5 billion euros per annum. And he issued a clarion call for that funding to be made possible in a newspaper article recently. He was then sort of indirectly slapped down by Olaf Scholz, who gave an interview to Stern newspaper, where Mr. Scholz said that due to the difficult public finance situation in Germany, they are going to have to sweat. Clearly doesn't seem keen on releasing those funds. And I think this has got Boris Pistorius very frustrated. Now, from a purely sort of helping Ukraine perspective, Mr. Pistorius is one of the sort of most solid politicians in Germany on helping Kyiv. He has on occasion sort of broken with Mr. Scholz on calls for one form of support or another to be delivered to Ukraine. And his real focus is trying to make the Bundeswehr, the German army, kriegstüchtig, or war ready. That's a kind of long-term project that's going to take several years, and therefore might well outlive Mr. Pistorius if his SPD party is ousted in elections next year. So that's the heart of the row. There have been some coalition sources sympathetic with Mr. Pistorius speaking to the newspapers today, saying that if Mr. Scholz sticks to his guns and doesn't unlock that funding, then the German defence minister may have no option but to resign. But I should stress that Mr. Pistorius himself has tried to play down this speculation. He says that some comments he made at a rather ill-tempered breakfast meeting with other coalition members this week, where he said things like, "I don't have to do this anymore." I'm sort of loosely translating the original German. He says that was a sort of expression of frustration, that he's got a job to do, that he's going to stick with it. And of course, if Germany's defence minister were to step down, he's not a hawk by our standards, but by German standards, he's one of the more solid guys, if you like, on supporting Ukraine. His departure would be very regrettable, I think, for the West. So he may well stay. We'll have to keep following that one over the next few days, but just keep an eye out, potentially for a big upset in German politics.
James, whilst you're here, has there been any talk, I'm talking about the Fico assassination attempt, any note out of Viktor Orban in Hungary yet? You mentioned that Putin, like many other world leaders, have sent well wishes to Fico. I mean, there's a reason why Putin's doing that, clearly. You can elaborate on that if you wish. But any peep out of Viktor Orban yet?
There has indeed been a peep from Viktor Orban. He was fairly quick out of the gate, issuing a tweet responding to this assassination attempt. He said he was deeply shocked by the heinous attack against my friend, Prime Minister Robert Fico. We pray for his health and quick recovery. God bless him and his country, Mr. Orban wrote. And as our listeners will be well aware, there is a very, very, very significant sort of thaw in relations underway between Hungary and Slovakia. Slovakia used to be, not under Mr. Fico really, but used to be a sort of quite dependable pro-Western party under Smer, the ruling party in Slovakia. It was actually one of the biggest supporters of Ukraine prior to the last election, which installed Mr. Fico. It was the country that oversaw the first delivery of MiG-29 fighter jets to Ukraine, for example. But Fico and Orban are in the middle of a sort of bromance, if you like. They've got very similar views on Russia. They are Putin friendly. They are in favor of ending the sanctions on Russia, which they consider harmful to the sort of the average Hungarian or the average Slovakian in terms of the cost of living. And one of the things, interestingly, that people have been trying to piece together in the wake of this assassination attempt is, where is this actually coming from? We've written and spoken before about Orban, and I think our readers will know a little bit about his sort of Russophilia. With Fico, it's a really interesting case because a profile of the Slovakian Prime Minister in Politico a few years ago said that his enmity towards Ukraine and his love of Putin may actually come from a sort of rather bizarre fight that he had with the Ukrainians all the way back in 2009, when there was a gas supply crisis and Mr. Fico needed to lobby Putin and lobby Ukraine in order to get the gas turned back on. He went to Kyiv for a sit-down with his Ukrainian counterpart and was expecting it to be held in private behind closed doors, Politico says. He then had to sit and wait in the corridors outside for 3 hours before he was received by the Ukrainian leader, only to discover that the room was full of journalists. Ukraine's president then prompted a load of difficult questions for the Slovakian PM. He was embarrassed. He was red in the face, according to one insider. And that seems to have sort of turned him against Ukraine, even though that may sound rather petty. And then during the same row, in contrast, he went to Putin directly in person. Putin rolled out the red carpet and treated the Slovakian leader with, he felt, much more respect. Now, I don't think that's driving all of the hostility towards Ukraine, but it is an interesting example of how personality clashes can sort of bring out underlying tensions between countries. It might be a little bit personal, basically, the Slovakian leader's enmity towards Ukraine and his getting into bed with Russia.
Brilliant. James, thanks so much. Do keep us in touch with what's happening with Boris Pistorius. No doubt we'll speak again in the next few days, because that's rumbling on. Now then, Santa's Little Helper has been out on the road. David, you're in somewhere near Lviv, I understand. You've been trying to relive your student days, I hear. Tell us about your journey in and what you're trying to get out of the next few days in Ukraine, who you've been speaking to and what you've been looking at.
Well, thank you very much, Dom. First of all, can I just say we must have a picture of Francis's suit. I'm very excited to hear what event he might be heading to tonight, whether it's networking, drinks one-on-one. You've got to put something out there on the internet for us to see Francis. But yeah, coming into Ukraine, very, very smooth. I came through the south, actually in a bus over the border, and at this point, 2 years in, you're sort of used to the rhythms of this, right? Most of the other people on the bus are women and children. I did chat to a very nice American volunteer and American guy actually who's got family in Ternopil and in Lviv, so he was coming to see his family, but also to do a bit of volunteering out here, so that was interesting. It's the quickest I've got into Ukraine, and it was actually quite nice to stop at Lviv, because of course usually if you're heading then out to east to Kiev or somewhere else, that's another 6 hours that you might have to spend on the road. So I got in, at about 8 p.m. last night, a bit earlier than I thought, which was very good. So it's first of all trying to understand Lviv a bit better. I've been here before, but only very fleetingly. I do believe that the best way to understand the place is just walk as much as you can, see as much as you can, and just try and absorb the vibe. So just to paint you a picture of where I am, I've left the media conference I've come to attend in Lviv over the next few days to a park, a big sprawling park opposite. I can see some older people on a bench. I can see a couple of students doing some work in the sun on their laptop. There's a woman playing with her dog. There's a family posing actually for pictures, maybe for social media, with their new baby. In front of me, there's some sort of memorial. I thought it might be for the army, but I think it might be football. There's an eagle standing on top of a football, a bit like the Tottenham Hotspur badge and crest. So that's where I am. As I said, in Lviv for the Lviv Media Forum, which is a conference of Ukrainian journalists and academics, and also international journalists and academics. So that's been interesting. That's just kicked off. I can talk you through a little bit of that later and what we hope to hear from that. But just on Lviv, of course, it's the major Ukrainian city in the far west, not too far at all, sort of an hour's drive, if less, from the Polish border. Originally was part of the Habsburg Empire, part of the Western empires, and got absorbed into modern Ukraine and sort of Soviet Ukraine a bit later. I've been here before. I was here in high summer last year, and it's fair to say I think that the city was buzzing. Every single bar and restaurant was full. You saw quite a few people in fatigues, obviously taking their sweethearts out, or that kind of thing. But it sometimes felt difficult to find the evidence of the war. I mean, I'm not saying at all that it's not there, but it's slightly more difficult. Lviv has a bit more of a relaxed vibe to it. So this time was a bit more interesting. There's a lot fewer people. I mean, granted, the caveat here is we're only in May, so that could change come the high summer. There's a distinct absence of men of fighting age, let's say that. So you don't see a lot of men between, let's say, 25 and 44, around 50. I've noticed that. I've also been told, keep your passport on you, because once you get out of the centre, the recruitment patrols and the police are more than happy to stop sort of men of fighting age walking on their own and just have a look at their papers. So keeping that quite close to me. I've also seen a few people walking around, obviously, who are amputees, who've lost limbs, and of course, I don't know if they were soldiers or not, but there's enough people walking around that you do get a sense of just little pieces of visual evidence that the war of course is here. Earlier today I went to the Lyshakiv cemetery, which is about sort of 25 minutes walk from the centre. I was there for another story to visit the grave of writer Victoria Amelina, which is just inside the cemetery, for a documentary coming out later this year. So I won't talk too much about that, but I did explore more of the cemetery. It's a sort of Lviv version of Père Lachaise, endless crypts and tombs and graves everywhere, sprawling over several hillsides on a beautiful morning. And I went to the Field of Mars, which is where they bury the soldiers killed in the war. And what we'll end the episode with today is my experience of that, because it was almost more tragic than I thought it would be. So that was an interesting experience. I think another thing to note today, actually, in Ukraine is it's Vyshyvanka Day. Vyshyvankas are the sort of traditional embroidered shirts, usually white with red sort of embroidery on top, but they don't have to be white. Lots of people wear all sorts of different colours. So I'd say maybe, just turning to my right now, there's a young woman wearing her Vyshyvanka escorting a nun by the arm. And I can see one or two other people in the park. Oh, there's a couple arm in arm coming towards me, both wearing their Vyshyvankas. Not everybody's wearing it, but certainly many people, so that's quite a nice thing. It's also Students' Day, so I've passed the university and a couple of high schools, and the students are all out wearing their Vyshyvankas, celebrating with their teachers. And I popped into one earlier, actually, to ask around and see what was going on. So again, we'll have a short recording from that, and I got to observe an arm wrestling match. The students are very proud of their capacity to arm wrestle on an arm wrestling table. They hope to be the Ukrainian champions in arm wrestling. Sadly, I did not partake, but I did observe it, which was interesting. So again, there'll be more recordings from that later. So that's kind of where we are. The conference has just started. I've ducked out to talk to you. Is there anything else I can tell you about Lviv that you'd like to know, Dom?
Well, yeah, I just noticed that when you were trailing this visit yesterday or the day before, I can't remember, I think it was the day before, you said that you were going to be very interested to see whether or not, I think you described it as the long tentacles of the war had reached Lviv, and if the vibe had changed, and if it had lost some of its exciting, slightly relaxed, maybe perhaps a bit detached atmosphere. So what are your first impressions?
I think on the surface you might think that. I think the minute you scratch a little deeper, you realise that it is everywhere. I mean, I saw things like, I've seen, an L200 pickup truck zoom past, which is one of the vehicles that often foreign volunteers bring to Ukraine. The Ukrainians love them. They turn them into evac vehicles. They turn them into mobile rocket launchers. And this one had been adapted, so it didn't have its sort of big machine gun on the back, but it was well on the way to becoming that. I've seen a couple of soldiers, I think, recruiting sergeants wandering about, a couple of vans, obviously transportation trucks for the soldiers. The Field of Mars was it's in some ways a beautiful place, and some ways such an awful place, because you see the scale of the loss endured by a community. I mean, there are hundreds and hundreds of graves there. So I think, spend a bit of time here. This is what I'm trying to do, really. Spend a bit more time rather than just rushing through to try and understand. And the vibe is different, of course. Lviv isn't as frequently under Russian aerial attack. Of course, it has been. And I think it was only last week that the thermal power plants to the north of the city were bombed. So, of course, it's known. I mean, the conference is taking place, I think, in a building next to a building that was hit by a missile last year. So the idea that people in Lviv don't know what it's like is, of course, erroneous. But there is a qualitative difference, I think, between here and somewhere like Kharkiv, which is shelled on a daily basis. There are, I've been told, rolling blackouts here of electricity, although what the Ukrainian state is trying to do is, like in Kiev and like in elsewhere, is sort of put them in time frames where you wouldn't necessarily notice, the middle of the night, that kind of thing. I haven't been able to get my hands on a schedule. I know that Kiev has published theirs. I haven't seen them on for Lviv, but I've been told that they're happening. So it's a difficult one. The minute you look closer and you look at the people and you see the absences, where are the young men, that kind of thing, you realise that it is really everywhere.
Hi, David. Glad you made the trip. My question just relates to the conference that you're attending. You said you might give us a little bit more information about that and who you might be hearing speak. And just one final question too. We can hear some singing in the background. Just wondering what that is.
Yes, well, it's Lviv, so there's always somebody singing in the background. I'm just turning around for you. There's a woman sitting on a bench playing a guitar, and there's a little kid with her mum, who I think is just getting out a wad of notes to go and give her some money. But it's rather beautiful, isn't it? Hopefully that'll be picked up on the microphone. I mean, I feel completely ridiculous, Francis. I'm sitting here in the park. Both my hands are occupied. I'm using one elbow to hold down my notes from one of the speeches I've just heard. But yeah, I think the little girl is. Oh no, maybe she's feeding a pigeon. I think I've misunderstood that. Sorry, that's your intrepid reporter not quite grasping the situation. But the musician has stopped. She's just turning the music, so maybe we'll get something else in a second. But yeah, regards to the conference, lots of speakers. I've just heard from Alexandra Matvichuk, who, of course, we interviewed Dom and Francis back in Kiev in February. I've spoken to her briefly once before, and obviously we spent an entire hour with her for the anniversary video that we filmed. So it was good to hear her again. Good to hear some of her talking points, what she wants to return to. I made quite a few notes. She started very movingly saying, how difficult it is to find the right words to convey what's actually happening here, and how it's very different reading the news than it is actually experiencing it and living it. Something she said to us before, that in her view, the international system is if not broken, then certainly breaking. She said, we're in a situation where the law doesn't work. The entire UN system of peace and security can't stop it. And can't stop it, of course, it's in reference to the Russian aggression. She said, rather movingly, I thought, you cannot confront a Russian tank with a copy of the Geneva Conventions. She talked very movingly about the situation in the occupied territories, about how in her work as a war crimes lawyer, she'd interviewed hundreds of people who had escaped either Russian captivity or Russian occupation, and she detailed stories of torture, rape, how people were compelled to write sort of confessions and documents with their own blood. She said that one woman told her that they'd cut her eye out with a spoon, and she used these obviously horrendous stories to make the point that just more to say that a sustainable peace means, from the Ukrainian perspective, that the occupied territories have to be returned, because they cannot, for reasons of peace and security and justice, let people suffer and let people be lost to a system which does that to them. She said this war is genocidal for us, which I think, given her what she said previously, we can understand. And she said, of course, that people in Ukraine have no other choice. It's, I think, for us to remember, when we speculate and when international experts speculate about, which bits of territory or, whatever Ukraine might give up for peace. And then what Matt Buchuk is saying is, well, is that really peace? Is it really peace if, millions of people are lost in the East to the kind of regime that does not value their lives? She said, just to finish off, the global approach must change. That's in terms of justice. She said that people are names. We must return their names. They're not just numbers. When we think of the murders and the war crimes, she said the world order based on the UN system is collapsing before our eyes, and that now fires could appear all over the globe. Unpunished evil just grows, which I thought was very moving, and there's a lot of truth to it. Just to finish, she said, we cannot rely on the UN, but we can rely on people, which I think, especially in Lviv, where you see, this is such a hub for rehabilitation, it's such a hub for international volunteers and Ukrainian volunteers coming through Lviv, using Lviv as a bit of a base. I think you can see exactly her points there. And so it was quite moving. That was the big keynote speech of today. She'd finished and I scooted out to come and talk to you. I'm not entirely sure what's happening the rest of the day, but I've already spotted a few friends of the podcast. We saw Natalia Humeniuk, said hello to her. She just popped up, who was obviously in the studio with us a couple of weeks ago. So hopefully there'll be a few more people that we can say hello to. There's, of course, our friends at the Kiev Independent. I think there's a whole team of them coming down either tonight or tomorrow. So it'll be good to catch up with them and hear some of their stories.
Coming up, we hear more from David in Lviv, as well as Francis, James, and David's final thoughts.
The late bloomers tend to have more curiosity. They tend to have more resilience.
There's stories and mythology that this country has woven around black men.
What if everything we've been taught is just all wrong?
What's worth more than this fear right now?
And that rising after failure is part of the glory of being a human being.
Listen to deeply personal, insightful, and thought-provoking stories from the world's leading thinkers and doers. Listen and subscribe to The Unmistakable Creative wherever you get your podcasts.
Francis, come running just as fast as you can and give us your final thought, please.
Well, it's great to hear from David, albeit on, of course, a terrible subject, hearing those remarks from the speech. There are reports that you touched on, Dom, from Vovchansk, of Russians refusing to allow people to evacuate, of taking civilian hostages and executing people. The fact this is no longer a surprise and has become an almost accepted part of the way Russia is waging this war is worth pausing a moment and reflecting on, I think. These are innocent civilians trying to live in their own country who are now under occupation today, who were not yesterday. We can predict what they'll suffer as a result. The suppression of their culture, their children potentially kidnapped and rehomed in Russia, and even the possibility of young men being conscripted into the Russian armed forces. All of these, again, are war crimes, violations of the world order that we sought to establish internationally after the horrors of the Second World War. And I was very glad that the German ambassador made reference to the special responsibility Germany has to Ukraine due to the horrors of that war, emphasising that so much of the conflict on the Eastern Front in World War II was fought in modern-day Ukraine, not in Russia, as Putin likes to claim. If anyone is in doubt about that, by the way, I highly recommend the war memoir by Guy Séjour called The Forgotten Soldier, often seen as the definitive German foot soldiers' account of the war on the Eastern Front. It is a horrifying read, all the more so, not for what Ukrainians endured 80 years ago, which is terrible enough, but especially because of the echoes of today, of what is being endured by the Ukrainian people. Tragically, it seems that when the world said never again, it didn't apply to Ukrainians.
Thanks, Francis. James, can I come to you, please, for your final thoughts?
Yes, thank you, David, for that really interesting insight into what's going on in Lviv. I think the attempted assassination of Mr. Fico over in Slovakia shows that tensions are just incredibly high at the moment, and there is a big concern over in Slovakia that this is not the end of the story. We focused on the sort of immediate situation in terms of the Prime Minister's health and his hopefully full recovery from this attempted assassination. But we know that there's been quite a bit of unrest in Slovakia. This same Prime Minister actually had to resign back in 2018 over mass protests about his alleged links to organised crime, which he denies. And we know that there's a lot of hybrid warfare underway by Russia at the moment in any EU country, even perhaps an EU country and NATO member, which is led by a man who seems perhaps a bit too close to Putin. There are still opportunities for propaganda and disruption and for basically causing embarrassment and inconvenience to the West there. So I think that's definitely something to keep an eye on in the weeks to come.
Thanks, James. David, please, over to you for your final thoughts for today.
Well, just very quickly, because of course we've got some of my recordings from earlier. I've just seen a bit of diplomacy happen. There's an EU representative here who gave one of the speeches, Rémy Duflo. I think about sort of, the European Union's support for Ukraine and what that means. I couldn't hear him very well, even in the conference hall. He was rather quiet and swallowed his words. He just walked past me, deep in conversation, very slowly with somebody. I'm not entirely sure who that is. Followed at about 10 paces by their security. So if you want to know what international diplomacy looks like, I'm watching them now, and I had to sort of rather hope that you wouldn't come to me too quick, because I wanted to talk about this. But I can see their security detail following them around the park. I wonder what's going on. I wonder what he's saying. I wonder who that is. I did think, actually, should I jump up and try and catch him? And then I spotted the rather burly security guard. But I'll try and keep them in my sights. So there we go. A little bit of diplomacy in a park in Lviv. Who knows what's being talked about?
Well, thanks, David. And yes, you absolutely should go and jump on that large burly gentleman and ask him what's going on. Let us know how that goes. David is in Lviv and has been speaking to students at their Students' Day at Lviv University.
My name is Nazar Ivanitsky. I am a teacher of this university.
So we're standing here in the courtyard of your university. What are we looking at? What is everybody wearing, the Vyshyvanka? Can you tell us about that?
Today is Vyshyvanka Day. And now we see the Students' Day of this university. And it's some events, sport events, somebody sell cooking and so on.
What has it been like for you teaching during the full-scale invasion for the past 2 years? How has your life changed?
Life very changed, and it's hard to teach because we have many alerts. We go in bomb shelters, and sometimes we have online study, and students don't know how to study in this time, in online or offline, and so on.
Working on another story, David visited the Lyshakiv cemetery earlier this morning. One of the things he wanted to look at was the Field of Mars, the burial place of soldiers killed in the war. This is what he found.
So I'm here in the vast, sprawling Lyshakiv cemetery in Lviv, in the far west of Ukraine. The cemetery, as I've discovered in the past half an hour, is huge. It sort of covers several small hills. You can very easily, as I did, get lost amongst the labyrinthine maze of graves, of crypts. It's an astonishing place, really. It made me think of Père Lachaise in Paris. And you have graves here from Polish families, from Ukrainian families. You can see Polish gravestones everywhere, Ukrainian as well. It charts the history of this region, this part of Ukraine over the past 100, 150 years. It's a beautiful day here in spring, there's sort of cloud in the sky, and you can hear the wind rushing through the trees. And I went into the cemetery to find and pay our respects to a friend of our work, Victoria Amelina, who was killed last year in a missile strike in Kramatorsk. And then after that I wanted to go and see the Field of Mars, which is the place in the cemetery which is for the soldiers killed in the war. And I went in completely the wrong direction, got completely lost, was surrounded by ivy-covered graves for about half an hour as I desperately tried to find the right way out. But I've just come down a hill and the field of Mars is beneath me. And I'm just taking a moment just to try and describe it because it's not what I expected at all. It's part of the cemetery, but it's in a completely new section. And every single grave is festooned with Ukrainian flags. You can see the red and black flag of the Ukrainian nationalists. You can see an Azov flag, an Azov battalion flag, the red flag with the cross of the Ukrainian armed forces, and wreaths of flowers decorating every single grave. But the reason I've stopped to record this is because of the almost utterly tragic scene I can see just beyond it, which is right in front of me. I can see maybe 100, 150 graves, and I can see them stretching off into the background behind some of the trees. You can see the flashes of green and blue and red and black, and in the distance you can see the hills outside Lviv looking over the scene, but you might just be able to hear it. They've just started up and they've just started digging, but there's a yellow JCB digger surrounded by mounds of brown earth. He's digging more graves. In fact, surrounded by this sort of blue fence, the area of graves that they're digging vastly exceeds the space that's already being used to house Ukraine's war dead. So in front of me, 150 graves maybe, flags, flowers, and just beyond it, a digger churning up earth for more of the dead.
Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from The Telegraph. To support our work and to stay on top of all of our Ukraine news, analysis and dispatches from the ground, please subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get your first 3 months for just £1 at www.telegraph.co.uk/Ukraine the Latest. Or sign up to Dispatches, our foreign affairs newsletter, bringing stories from our award-winning foreign correspondents straight to your inbox. We also have a Ukraine Live blog on our website, where you can follow updates as they come in throughout the day, including insights from regular contributors to this podcast. We also do the same for other breaking international stories. You can listen to this conversation live at 1 p.m. London time each weekday on Twitter or X Spaces. Follow The Telegraph on X so that you don't miss it. To our listeners on YouTube, please note that due to issues beyond our control, there is sometimes a delay between broadcast and upload, so if you want to hear Ukraine the Latest as soon as it's released, do refer to podcast apps. If you appreciated this podcast, please consider following Ukraine the Latest on your preferred podcast app and leave us a review, as it helps others find the show. Please also share it with those who may not be aware we exist. As the disinformation war ramps up, we are relying on your support more than ever. You can also get in touch directly to ask questions or give comments by emailing ukrainepod@telegraph.co.uk. We do continue to read every message. You can also contact us directly on X. You can find our handles in the description for this episode. As ever, we are especially interested to hear where you are listening from around the world. Ukraine the Latest was today produced by Phil Atkins. Executive producers are David Knowles and Louisa Wells.
The late bloomers tend to have more curiosity. They tend to have more resilience.
There's stories and mythology that this country has woven around black men.
What if everything we've been taught is just all wrong?
What's worth more than this fear right now?
And that rising after failure is part of the glory of being a human being.
Listen to deeply personal, insightful, and thought-provoking stories from the world's leading thinkers and doers. Listen and subscribe to The Unmistakable Creative wherever you get your podcasts.